Upon reviewing a photo, 20 years after his daughter's disappearance, a millionaire discovers the betrayal behind this tragedy. Could it be a clue to find her? The investigation file lay untouched on Ethan's mahogany desk, its edges worn from years of desperate searching. As a millionaire who had built his fortune from nothing, he could afford the finest private investigators, yet none had brought him closer to finding his daughter. Lily, the disappearance that haunted him for 2 decades, left an emptiness no amount of wealth could fill. His fingers traced the silver frame holding Sarah's photograph. His beloved wife's smile forever frozen in time, taken just months before cancer claimed her life. The garden visible in the background was her sanctuary, now overgrown and neglected, much like his hope of finding their child. "Mr. Crawford," his housekeeper called softly from the doorway. "I found another box while clearing the attic." Ethan's heart quickened as he opened the dusty cardboard box. Among old birthday cards and school drawings lay a photograph he'd never seen before. In it, 16-year-old Lily wore the diamond necklace he'd given her on her last birthday, her final birthday with them. The truth of that day still tormented him. How could she vanish without a trace just 3 weeks later? He squinted at the image, noticing something peculiar about the necklace's clasp. Under the desk lamp's glow, he could make out tiny engravings he'd never noticed before. Could this be a clue after all these years? The past washed over him like a tidal wave as he remembered that birthday morning. Sarah, already weakened by chemotherapy, had insisted on baking Lily's favorite chocolate cake. His sister-in-law Margaret had arrived early to help, her behavior oddly tense. "Sarah, you need to rest," Margaret had urged, her voice carrying an edge that seemed out of place for the celebration. "I need to make this perfect," Sarah had whispered back. "We don't know how many more birthdays I'll see." Ethan closed his eyes. Remembering how Sarah had pulled Margaret aside later that evening, their hushed conversation in the garden had seemed suspicious even then, but grief and worry over Sarah's health had clouded his judgment. "Promise me you'll protect her, Margaret," Sarah had pleaded. "When the time comes, promise me you'll keep our secret." What secret had his wife carried to her grave? The question gnawed at him as he studied the photograph again. The loss of both his wife and daughter within months had nearly destroyed him. Now, this mysterious engraving offered a thread of hope. However fragile, his childhood friend and retired detective, James, had always insisted there was more to Lily's disappearance than met the eye. "Family secrets," he'd said, "have a way of surfacing when you least expect them." Ethan reached for his phone, his hand trembling. The betrayal he sensed lurking beneath the surface of his memories threatened to unravel everything he thought he knew about his family's tragedy. "James, I need you to look at something. I think I found a clue about Lily." As he hung up, his eyes drifted to the last family photo taken before Sarah's death. The identity they projected, the perfect happy family, now seemed like a facade. What mysteries lay buried beneath their smiles? And why did Sarah's last conversations with Margaret feel so crucial now? The gardens outside his study window had once been filled with Lily's laughter. Now they stood as a silent testament to his failure to protect her. But perhaps, after 20 years of suspense and heartache, this tiny engraving would lead him to the redemption he so desperately sought. Margaret's promise. Sarah sat on the garden bench, her face pale and tired, yet her eyes shone with determination as she called Margaret to join her. The fragrance of blooming roses filled the air, masking the heaviness of the conversation to come. Margaret, hesitant but loyal, sat beside her sister, clutching Sarah's frail hand. "Margaret," Sarah began, her voice soft but resolute. "You know I don't have much time left. My greatest worry isn't for me but for Lily, Ethan. He's drowning in grief, and it will only worsen when I'm gone. I need you to promise me something." Margaret frowned, her heart aching as she watched her sister's strength falter. "Anything, Sarah. You must look after Lily. Protect her from the storm of pain that will follow my death. Ethan will need time to heal, and Lily needs someone stable, someone who can guide her. Promise me you'll be that person." Margaret hesitated, feeling the weight of Sarah's words. Her love for Lily was undeniable, but the responsibility seemed daunting. Still, she couldn't refuse her dying sister. "I promise, Sarah, I'll care for her as if she were my own." Relieved, Sarah smiled faintly and rested her head against the bench. "Thank you, Margaret. Knowing Lily will have you gives me hope." Months later, Sarah passed away, leaving Ethan and Lily consumed by their shared sorrow. Ethan, overwhelmed by the loss of his beloved wife, withdrew into his world of wealth and memories, leaving Margaret to fulfill her promise. She took Lily into her home, determined to provide the stability Sarah had entrusted her to offer at first. Margaret did her best to support Lily, comforting the young girl through her grief and trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. However, the weight of raising a grieving teenager began to take its toll. Lily's sadness was profound, and Margaret, struggling with her own sense of inadequacy, found it increasingly difficult to connect with her. Ethan, lost in his own world of sorrow, rarely visited. His focus remained on his late wife's memory and his vast business empire, which served as both a distraction and a reminder of all he had lost. Lily's sense of abandonment deepened, and Margaret began to doubt her ability to fulfill Sarah's wish. One evening, after a particularly tense conversation with Lily about school, Margaret sat alone, nursing a glass of wine. The thought of her sister's dying request haunted her, but so did her growing conviction that she wasn't the right person to care for Lily. It was then that an idea took root, a desperate, misguided idea. A week later, Margaret contacted a couple she had met through mutual acquaintances. They were a kind, childless pair who had recently lost their own daughter in a tragic accident. Their grief mirrored Lily's, and Margaret convinced herself they could provide the love and stability the girl needed. "Lily, I've found a family who can take care of you while your father sorts things out," Margaret said one evening, her tone betraying her guilt. "It's just temporary, I promise." Lily's wide eyes reflected fear and confusion. "But why can't I stay here?" "I'll be good, Aunt Margaret, please." Margaret's heart broke at the desperation in Lily's voice, but she steeled herself. "This is for the best, sweetheart. They'll give you the attention I can't right now, you'll see." The couple took Lily in days later, showering her with kindness and trying to ease her transition. Margaret, unable to face the consequences of her betrayal, cut off contact with both Lily and the couple, severing all ties to her sister's daughter. When Ethan finally emerged from his fog of grief months later, he visited Margaret to inquire about Lily. She avoided his gaze, her hands trembling as she offered a false explanation. "Ethan, she ran away. I've searched everywhere, but I haven't found her." "I'm so sorry." Ethan's devastation was palpable. He blamed himself for her disappearance, convinced his neglect had driven her away. Overcome with guilt, he launched a relentless search for Lily that spanned decades, hiring private investigators and following every lead, no matter how faint. Margaret, meanwhile, carried the heavy burden of her secret. Her betrayal of Sarah's trust and Ethan's love gnawed at her soul, but fear kept her silent. She justified her actions by telling herself that Lily was safe and happy, but the truth weighed on her more with each passing year. Margaret's promise to Sarah, once made with love and sincerity, had turned into a web of lies and guilt. Her decision to hand Lily over to another family, born out of desperation, set in motion a chain of events that would fracture her relationship with Ethan and haunt her for the rest of her life, in the silence of her empty home. She often stared at old photographs of Sarah and Lily, wondering if she had made the right choice or if she had simply failed them both. Little did she know, the past she thought she had buried would soon resurface, bringing with it the truth, the pain, and the possibility of redemption. The betrayal. The rain fell steadily outside Ethan's grand estate as he sat at his desk. Lost in thought, the years since Lily's disappearance had been cruel, marked by unanswered questions and relentless guilt. Ethan, once a commanding figure in the world of business, now seemed a shadow of himself, burdened by the mystery that had consumed his life. It was on one such stormy evening that his phone rang. Breaking the heavy silence, the voice on the other end was familiar but laced with hesitation. "Ethan?" Margaret began, her tone tentative. "We need to talk. It's about Lily." Ethan's breath caught, and he gripped the phone tightly. "What do you mean? Have you found something?" "Not exactly," she replied. "But I have a truth to tell. I can't carry it any longer. An hour later, Margaret arrived at the estate, her face pale and her hands trembling as she clutched a worn envelope. Ethan met her in the study, his expression a mixture of hope and suspicion. "You've kept secrets from me for 20 years. Margaret," he said, his voice low but firm. "Why now?" Margaret avoided his gaze, sitting on the edge of the armchair as if the weight of her confession might crush her. She held out the envelope, unable to speak until Ethan gestured for her to continue. "I betrayed Sarah's trust," she began, her voice cracking. "She asked me to care for Lily, to protect her after she passed, and I promised her I would, but I failed. I failed you both." Ethan froze, his mind racing as he processed her words. "What are you saying? Where is Lily?" Margaret's tears began to fall freely. "I thought I was doing what was best. You were lost in grief, unable to care for her, and I couldn't handle it. I contacted a couple, people who had lost their own daughter. They seemed kind, stable. I gave Lily to them. I told her it was temporary, but it wasn't." The room seemed to spin around Ethan as the truth struck him like a blow. He clenched his fists, his voice rising. "You gave my daughter away without telling me, without giving me a chance." "You weren't ready," Margaret shouted back, her own guilt fueling her defense. "You were barely functioning, Ethan. Lily needed more than what I could give her, and you were drowning." Ethan turned away, his chest heaving with anger and despair. He stared out the rain-streaked window, his thoughts a chaotic mix of betrayal and heartbreak. "You had no right, Margaret. No right to decide what was best for her." Margaret stood, desperate to explain. "I was wrong, Ethan. I see that now. I thought I was protecting her, but I robbed you both of something irreplaceable. I've carried this guilt every day, and it's eaten me alive." Ethan faced her again, his expression hardened. "Do you even know where she is now?" Margaret nodded, her hands shaking as she handed him the envelope. "She's been trying to find you." "Ethan, the family told her the truth when she turned 21. She calls herself Claire now. She's married, with a child of her own, but she's searching for you." Ethan collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands. The name Claire echoed in his mind, a glimmer of hope piercing through his despair. He opened the envelope, revealing a photograph of a young woman holding a toddler. Her eyes, so familiar yet distant, stared back at him. Margaret continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've already contacted her. She wants to meet you, but she's afraid. She remembers the pain, the confusion. She needs to know who you are now, not the broken man she left behind." Ethan's fingers traced the edges of the photograph as tears filled his eyes. "I don't know if I can face her, Margaret. I've spent 20 years searching, blaming myself. How do I make up for all that lost time?" "You start by being honest," Margaret said, her own tears flowing freely. "She deserves the truth, just as much as you do." The following morning, Ethan sat in his study, the photograph still in his hand. He thought of Sarah, of her faith in him, and of the promise Margaret had broken. His anger toward his sister-in-law hadn't faded, but it was overshadowed by the possibility of finding Lily, Claire, again. He called his childhood friend James, a retired detective who had worked tirelessly on the case in its early days. "James, I need your help," Ethan said, his voice steady with resolve. "I've found her, or at least I think I have." James arrived within the hour, his investigative instincts sharp as ever. "This isn't just about finding her, is it?" James asked, studying the photograph. "It's about repairing what's been broken." Ethan nodded. "I need to be the father she deserved, even if it's 20 years too late." As the day unfolded, Margaret helped arrange a meeting with Claire. The tension in the air was palpable as Ethan prepared to face the daughter he had lost to grief, betrayal, and time. He stood before the mirror, adjusting his tie with trembling hands. For the first time in decades, hope outweighed his fear. Margaret approached him cautiously. "Ethan, whatever happens, she needs to see your love, not your guilt, not your anger, just your love." He nodded, his voice barely audible. "I just want her to know she was never forgotten." Truth and redemption. The late afternoon sun filtered through the large windows of Ethan's study as he sat silently, staring at the photograph of Claire. Her resemblance to Sarah was undeniable, and the realization filled him with a mix of hope and sorrow. James sat across from him, studying the envelope Margaret had provided. "She looks happy," James said finally. "But there's something in her eyes, like she's still searching." Ethan nodded, his voice hoarse. "She's been searching for the truth just as I have. But it's Margaret's betrayal that cast the longest shadow. How do I face Claire knowing I let her slip away, even if it wasn't entirely my fault?" James leaned forward, his tone calm but firm. "You face her with honesty, Ethan. The truth, no matter how painful, is the only way to heal." Hours later, Ethan stood at the entrance of a quiet cafe in a neighboring town. The modest building was a stark contrast to the grandeur he was accustomed to, yet it felt fitting for such a monumental moment. Inside, Claire sat at a small table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. Her husband and child waited nearby, giving her space for this long-awaited meeting. Margaret had arranged the reunion, but her absence was deliberate. "This is your moment," she had told Ethan before he left. "She doesn't need me there. She needs you." Ethan took a deep breath, his heart pounding as he approached the table. Claire looked up, her gaze meeting his, and time seemed to freeze. Her eyes held both familiarity and caution, a reflection of the years they had spent apart. "Claire," Ethan said softly, his voice trembling. "It's been so long." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "I wasn't sure if I'd ever see you again." Ethan sat down, his hands clasped tightly on the table. "There isn't a day that's gone by when I haven't thought of you. I searched everywhere, but I never imagined. I didn't know what Margaret had done." Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. "She told me everything, about my mother's promise, about her decision to give me away. I can't say I understand it, but I've come to terms with it." Ethan shook his head, his voice breaking. "I failed you, Claire. I let my grief blind me, and I wasn't there when you needed me most. For that, I'm so sorry." Her expression softened slightly as she studied him. "I remember bits and pieces of those days. I remember you holding me, telling me stories about the stars. But I also remember the sadness. The weight of it, I thought I was the reason for your pain." Ethan's heart shattered at her words. "You were never the reason for my pain, Claire. You were my hope. Losing you, it was like losing Sarah all over again." As their conversation deepened, Claire opened up about her life with the Andersons, the couple who had raised her after Margaret's betrayal. "They were good to me," she admitted. "They gave me a stable home, encouraged my art. But there was always a part of me that felt incomplete, like something important was missing." Ethan listened intently, every detail adding another piece to the puzzle of her life. "Your art," he said, his voice tinged with awe. "I've seen it. The gallery in town had a display of your work. I didn't know it was you, but I felt connected to it." Claire's lips curved into a small smile. "The garden, that's where so many of my memories come from. I painted it over and over, trying to hold on to something I couldn't quite remember. It was my way of keeping the past alive." Ethan reached into his pocket, pulling out the photograph Margaret had given him. "Your mother left us both something to hold on to," he said, sliding it across the table. "That necklace you wore, it led me back to you. The engraving was a clue, a promise from Sarah that we'd find our way back together." Claire picked up the photo, her fingers trembling as she traced the image. "The necklace. I never took it off. It was the only piece of my old life I kept, and now I know why." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Claire's husband. Michael, carrying their toddler, the little boy, wide-eyed and curious, clung to his father's leg as Claire introduced them. "This is Ethan, my father," she said, her voice steady but emotional. Ethan knelt down, his eyes level with the child's. "Hello," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You look just like your mother did at your age." The boy smiled shyly, and Ethan felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. He stood, turning to Michael. "Thank you," he said earnestly, "for being there for her when I couldn't be." Michael nodded, his respect for Ethan evident. She's always spoken of you, even when she didn't know where to find you. This meeting, it means everything to her." As the afternoon wore on, the tension between Ethan and Claire began to dissipate. They spoke of the past, of Sarah's final days, and of the betrayal that had kept them apart. Claire's forgiveness was cautious but genuine, her understanding tempered by years of longing for answers. "I want to visit the garden," she said finally, her voice quiet but resolute. "The one from my memories, the one in my paintings. I think it's time." Ethan agreed, his heart swelling with a mix of hope and fear. Together, they made plans to visit the garden the next day. Accompanied by Claire's family and the Andersons, who had supported her through so much that evening, Ethan returned home with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in decades. Margaret was waiting for him, her expression anxious. "How did it go?" she asked. Ethan hesitated, his anger toward her still simmering beneath the surface. "She wants to move forward," he said finally. "She's willing to forgive, but it will take time. And as for you, that's something you'll have to earn." Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do whatever it takes." Ethan turned to leave, but paused in the doorway. "Sarah trusted you with her greatest treasure. Margaret, you may have betrayed that trust, but you have a chance to make it right. Don't waste it." The Garden of Redemption. The morning sun bathed the garden in a golden glow as Ethan stood at its edge, his heart racing with anticipation. The once neglected sanctuary had been restored to its former beauty. With blooming roses cascading over trellises and the scent of lavender filling the air, it was a place of memories, of loss, and now, of healing. Claire arrived moments later, hand in hand with Michael and their son. The Andersons followed close behind, their faces reflecting a mixture of pride and sadness. Margaret lingered at the gate, hesitant but present, her guilt weighing heavily as she watched the family reunite. "This is how I remembered it," Claire said softly, her eyes scanning the vibrant colors of the garden. "It's like stepping into one of my paintings." Ethan approached her, holding out a small box. "I found this yesterday," he said. "Your mother left it buried beneath her favorite rose bush. It's a letter. I think it's meant for both of us." Claire took the box, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside lay a folded piece of paper, its edges yellowed with time. Ethan stepped closer as she began to read aloud, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "My dearest family," the letter began. "If you're reading this, it means the truth has found its way to you, Ethan. My love, I always knew your heart was big enough to endure the pain of my passing, but I feared for Lily. The grief you carried was heavy, and I worried it would eclipse the light in her life. That's why I asked Margaret to step in, to ensure our daughter had a chance to grow beyond the shadows of loss. I never meant for her to be taken from you, Margaret. If you're here, I forgive you. I know your choices were made with love, however misguided. Lily, my sweet girl, you are the brightest part of my life. No matter what happens, remember that you were deeply loved by both your parents. This garden was always a place of joy for me, and I hope it becomes one for you as well. In its blooms, you'll find not just my memory, but the promise of new beginnings." Claire's voice broke as she finished reading, and she clutched the letter to her chest. Ethan reached out, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "Your mother always believed in us," he said, even when everything seemed lost. The family moved to the rose arbor, where a bench had been placed in Sarah's memory. They sat together, sharing stories of the past. Claire spoke of her childhood with the Andersons, painting a picture of love and support. Ethan shared memories of Sarah's laughter and the hope she had carried despite her illness. As the sun climbed higher, Margaret finally stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "I don't deserve your forgiveness," she said, her voice shaking, "but I need to say I'm sorry to all of you. I failed Sarah and I failed Lily. I thought I was doing what was best, but I see now how much pain I caused." Claire looked at her aunt, her expression unreadable. "You hurt us, Margaret," she said finally, "but you also gave me a chance to find myself. And now we have a chance to rebuild. For that, I'm willing to try." Margaret's tears fell freely as she nodded. "Thank you. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right." The group spent the day in the garden, planting new flowers as a symbol of their shared commitment to the future. Claire's son toddled among the blooms, his laughter echoing through the space that had once been silent with grief. Later, as twilight descended, Claire presented Ethan with a painting she had brought from her studio. It depicted the garden in full bloom, with a family standing united among the roses. Sarah's figure was there too, her face serene as she watched over them. "This is how I see us now," Claire said, her voice steady. "Not just a family shaped by tragedy, but one that chose to heal together." Ethan's voice was thick with emotion as he replied, "Your mother would be so proud of you, Claire. And so am I." As the stars appeared in the darkening sky, the family gathered for one final moment. They lit candles throughout the garden, their flames flickering in the breeze. Claire stood beside her father, holding his hand as they looked out over the glowing scene. "This garden is a second chance," Claire said softly. "A place to let go of the past and embrace what's ahead." Ethan nodded, his heart full for the first time in decades. "It's more than a garden," he said. "It's a reminder that even after the deepest loss, there's always hope." Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this story. Click on the card above to watch more incredible stories. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment below. I absolutely love reading your thoughts, and your feedback inspires me to keep creating these amazing stories.